here. Well, that was that was encouraging. I have some questions. People out in Webland can also pose questions. I think you can even speak if you have a microphone on your laptop. We could hear you. Okay, can I ask some questions if there's nobody else?
Please.
First, I'm amazed that we need to work from Aristotle, Aquinas, to the great Simeone and Bourdieu, to read a telephone book. Oh, somebody's trying something. Let me go to the theory. I'll come to the telephone book later in the debate, perhaps. But the point raised, the debate in France, it seems to me absurd to have these abstract debates about sociological concepts, such as how individual are the social determinants, when it depends, surely, on the kinds of problems you're trying to resolve, the hypotheses you have, and the very societies you're working on. I know, for example, I remember in my time in Africa, I would ask people in Ndebele, workers I was working with, I'd say, what do you think about apartheid? What do you think about the future of this country? And traditionally, the answer always was, ask my headman. He'll tell you what I think. That is, that individuality, individualization, depends on so many historical and cultural factors. Isn't it a little absurd to try to find or argue about even sociological concepts as if it weren't the data, after all, that resolves the questions of their validity or not?
Well, yeah, I understand the objection. But of course, the habitus, as I presented it here, and I mentioned it briefly at the beginning, is only one concept which can help us understand what is going on in a specific translation situation. Because the habitus, of course, is not something which is the ultimate wisdom we can gain once we take the habitus and try to explain the behavior, if you want, of translators in a specific historical situation. But I think what is quite important in the habitus, and this is why I try to focus on the historical details also of the concept, is that obviously we have a concept here which, as a concept, first of all, troubled various scholars over the century, or let's say more than 2,000 years. So it seems as if the claim to describe the behavior, because this is something which in a sort of in a very simplistic way, we can equal it, of course, with behavior, with socialization, with social behavior, whatever. But as we can see from the various accounts I have delivered at the beginning of this paper, we can see that the claim to describe this situation has to go beyond such simplistic concepts like behavior. Because maybe behavior has become, over the years, a quite biologistic connotation. So when we have habitus, this means in our research as scholars, we try to find categories which we can adopt not only for one specific situation, like the situation which I described here in my case study, but which helps us to measure different, different phenomena against a very specific historical or spatial background. So I think that when we talk about habitus, it is something which can help us reveal not only the behavior of a person, but also in which way the impact of this habitus in larger context of the results which it can reveal. When you talk about the social environments where, in our case, translation takes place. This is another argument for me that we can work very well with Habitus, because for me, Habitus and of course other categories in social theory help us very much and in a very refined way to connect, as I said, very briefly mentioned too in my paper, the social analysis and the text analysis in itself, up to the cultural turn, more or less. We centered very much on the reflection, on the analysis of the text. When it was discovered that something happens outside the text, which was discovered by others too, but the cultural turn allowed us to talk more loudly about it, we found in many accounts, we found a sort of contradiction between the translation process as such and the environment of the translation. It was very difficult, methodologically also, to connect, to better connect the translation decisions with the constraints which were conditioning this translation action, the translation process. So I think with the Habitus and other categories, it is easier to describe and to reveal, to detect which are the forces which drive the translation decisions, not only as an individual, because as I said, the Habitus is of course not only an individual phenomenon, but is also a class phenomenon or professional phenomenon or whatever.
Andrew, do you want to come up here, or can I?
If I just tell you and then you can give it to the mic, it's easy, it's quicker. What's the relation between the concept of habitus and the concept of attitude? Mm-hmm. What's the connection between the two?
What's the relation between the concept of habitus and the concept of attitude, or disposition, or virtue, perhaps?
Okay, dispositions are part of the habitus, of course. But attitude is something which I think is much less than habitus. Attitude is something which, of course, is also shaped. First of all, attitude it's not a concept which has been generally accepted in social sciences. Attitude is something which is mentioned in many accounts by different scholars, by different sociologists, but it has never been theoretically conceptualized. And attitude, to my opinion, as far as I do know, has never been really integrated into a larger theory of social, I don't say social behavior because it's already too explicit, but maybe of social action in general. Yes. And
excuse me.
I knew it was going to get complicated.
I'll protest in a small way, if I may. Surely attitude is a central concept in social psychology. There are standardized attitude tests, there are theories of attitude, there are standard ways of measuring and testing for attitude types and so on, so on, so on. It's very standard. Maybe not in sociology, but in psychosociology, or SOCUS. What do I mean? Sociopsychology? Which is the one I mean? The mixture. Now, surely Habitus is really trying to stake a claim for a space for itself, precisely, not so much in sociology, but in psychosociology. Or do I mean sociopsychology? What is the right word?
When it all comes together.
Where it all comes together, the general blurbs in the middle of it. I mean, isn't that where you would situate Habitus? And isn't that precisely where the concept of attitude is already waiting, sitting there?
No, and I tell you why. Not to my opinion, because I want to situate translation more and more general, maybe, in social sciences context and not in psychology, even if it's social or socio-psychology. I think it could be part, maybe, of a broader concept, of a broader conceptualization of a social science of the translation. But I think it is not enough as an attitude, as a concept. It is not enough because it does not really connect to other categories in the social sciences arena, if you want. This is why I would rather object to it. It could be, as I said before, it could be maybe part of it. It could explain some very specific translation situations where the focus is exactly on, for example, psychological features which help make up the translation situation under social perspective. But for me, it is not part of a social theory. It is part rather of a psychologically driven social arena. So this is something which is, for me, it is part of it, but it is not really covering the whole dispositions, as Anthony said, the whole disposition which drive the individual, the agent, whatever it is, which drive its actions, its decisions in a specific social field. This is why, would be my objection to attitude.
Thank you.
Wait a minute, I've got to have it. I've got to get something off my chest, then we'll unleash Professor Evans on her. I think personally that habitus is a phlogiston type concept.
I don't understand.
Phlogiston? You correct me if I'm wrong, it's this 19th century chemistry when they observed fire.
Okay, I
okay.
didn't understand the English word. Okay.
Thank you. But they were explain what is it that's consumed when fire burns. Okay, without knowing that it's oxygen. They invented this element which they called phlogiston, which was the stuff that was consumed when fire burns, right? So they didn't know what was happening there, but they had to have something there, so they threw a name at this something. And I think when you get a theory, I mean, the problem for me in analysing social relations is who has agency, who has power. And then you come up and say, well, there must be something that they have in common, so it's structured and structuring. It has agency and it doesn't have it. No. You're just not addressing the problem. You're saying, well, there's something there, so I'll throw a name at it. And then the psychological determinants, let's throw it in the phlogiston. There's a social determinants, let's throw it in the phlogiston. You've got a discourse of advertising here. You're in the phone book, you're in the nascent period of people learning how to advertise. Okay, and you've picked it up and you've thrown it into the phlogiston. Everything can become habitus, except sociological attitudes, of course, so psychological attitudes. Surely that's a very weak kind of concept. Surely it's something, it's sort of an excuse for not getting down to asking very exact questions and looking for very exact solutions. That would be my criticism. And I'm not sure that the telephone book is giving you anything that belongs to a person. I think there's so many mediating discourses there.
Yes, there are many mediating discourses, I agree with you, and of course, and I think this point is very interesting, very important for the habitus too, that we have here an emerging discourse of advertisement, which I think is something which I did not point to because this was not my point, I was trying to get at. But at the same time, as I said before, habitus is only one point of a whole social theory in order to understand what is going on. And of course, these are also a telephone book or an address book is not an individual. No, fortunately it is not. But what I tried to get at is to show that there was no, or hardly any submissive habitus. I don't want to try the habitus as such, but I want to try that there is no submissive habitus in these address books.
What would count as an example of a submissive habitus in these address books?
Come and wimp me, beat me. So, and the question by Andrew was, what would count as submissiveness in these advertisements? A
submissive account of a habitus could be, for example, which I have seen sometimes in short biographies, in very well, I was doing a lot of research on the translators in the second half of the 19th century, and when you look at the biographies of different translators, then you can see very well that the translation activity as such is shown always in a secondary sentence. Then they are, I don't know what, they are everything else than translators, even if translation for them was in many cases the main profession. So for me it was very interesting that here, where they have the possibility to show up in the public, because so many people had these address books, of course. It was very interesting that in a public offering their abilities or their services to a public in a way which had nothing to do with their behavior, if you want, or with their habitus, which they showed in biographies, as I said before, or in some other accounts, which I cannot go into details, but I can tell you a few examples of it, which was not closely related to showing the profession of translation. So I found it extremely interesting that when they come to the core, to the profession which they were really doing, and when they were going together in translation bureaus, then in an official book with an official discourse, they tried now to, this was a sort of structuring their own profession. This was my feeling in it. That it was quite timid in the beginning, and it became ever more professional, whatever it is, ever more professional over the years. So this is where you see a very strong difference in over the years, over these 40 years, which I was examining. Is this more or less?
Thank you. Very good. We'll move to Professor Evan Zohar. I'll sneak in a question from Iraq, from Iran. Bashir is going to get his question now. Where's his question? He wants to know, should we be teaching translatorial habitus?
No.
How would we know how to teach it?
No, you cannot teach it.
And
as far I try to show that habitus is not something where we say my habitus doesn't exist. The habitus is incorporated. The habitus is something which is part of our body life and part of our, of course, of our discursive manifestations. But it is mostly something which is unconscious and is something which we can reconstruct a posteriori, but not a priori. So this means that we cannot teach it, but of course what we can do when we know, and this is what the habitus concept tries to show in its societal context, when we know what it is made up, when we know what a translatorial habitus should be or should not be, then it is of course possible to teach around the habitus and talk about the various features which we do, of course, in translation training, translators training, which helps also, I don't know, working against invisibility, working in favor of, all the features which make up a translator, which meets the requirements of a present-day translator or interpreter.
very mysterious, like when priests tell me about our soul. Got to be there somewhere. Sorry, Professor Evans.
No, go ahead.
No, I'm not going to go and tell you about the soul.
I like sitting here in front of a microphone, not having to say anything.
Short, pertinent comments, please.
Short, pertinent comments. Well, where shall I start? I will start with the comment that although habitus is a 2,000 years old concept, most people use it after Bourdieu. He popularized it, people adopted it in his interpretation. He admits that it had been borrowed by him from Norbert Elias's works, as far as I remember. And I had several opportunities of discussing Habitus directly with Bourdieu when I stayed at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. I propose to have some meta-theoretical look, very briefly, 2 minutes, on the whole case. Yes, because as you said, I'm here in the middle position between Anthony and Michaela, because I don't think it's a phlogiston sort of concept, but on the other hand, it's a concept hastily baked out of the necessity to deal with something that Bourdieu didn't have the terminology for, already conceptual framework for, and I'll explain. Bourdieu came from anthropology to sociology. So he was a sociologist with very much, he was working in Algeria for 10 years as an anthropologist. He published early anthropological works, and as, sorry, what happened?
A little further away.
Okay. And as an anthropologist, he knew that in order to describe a culture, you can make even the most primitive, with the most primitive method, you can make a list of features, a catalog of features describing a culture, which was not accepted by sociologists at the time. So he wanted to combine contents of a culture with agency and power relations. So for power relations, he couldn't use such a term as system, for instance. Why is Bourdieu not using the term system in his theories? Because the word system in French tradition is such a rigid sort of concept that you cannot. Sorry, what happens with the microphone?
That's okay.
Okay, let's forget about it.
Yeah.
You cannot use it, so it was replaced by Bourdieu with the term champ, field, and but the idea, the basic idea of systems inherited from Saussure was explained by Bourdieu as prise de position, assuming positions. That's the binary opposition conceptualization, very basic to system theory. So instead of system, you said champ. Instead of binary of relationships, you used prise de position. Now Bourdieu lacked something that semiotics has, or linguistics had prepared for us, and that's the idea of a repertoire. The idea of a repertoire discussed by Jacobson and the Prague School people and all theories of systems speak about something that is learned by people who grow up in a culture. How do you get agency if you don't have a certain baggage, a certain stock of options in your culture? Semiotics has it. So in semiotics you say that a culture is more or less equivalent to a repertoire of possibilities, and individuals, and any single individual or any group in a society learns a set of options, internalizes those options. They may become psychological realities, as Andrew said, and they may be partly conscious and partly unconscious, as culture is on the whole. We use culture mostly unconsciously, but there are many features we use consciously in certain positions. And Bourdieu sensed in a way that he needed this. He couldn't use such terms as model or pattern, modelli, modèle en français, in French, modelli in Italian, patterns in English anthropology, in Anglo-American anthropology, etc. So he adopted Elias Habitus, and Habitus gave him the possibility to talk about this stock of features that characterizes groups or individuals. Groups and individuals. So if you are born into a certain group, in a society, you get to learn as a child, from your childhood, a set of features, for instance, how to eat. Bourdieu discusses that at length in his Distinction. That is, if you are coming from a working class group, you eat with your back teeth. If you belong to the bourgeoisie, you eat with your front teeth. This is why if you are a bourgeois in France, you eat fish. If you are a working class person, you eat meat. You cannot eat meat with the front teeth. You cannot eat fish with the back teeth. This is Bourdieu's argument. And therefore, your habitus, that is the features that you learn from your childhood, because your mother cooked meat for you and never cooked fish for you, and because males in working class groups wouldn't eat fish in France because this is eating like a woman, eating like a female with your teeth. Bourdieu even goes further on to say that because of that, the intelligentsia in France pronounces the language from the front part of the mouth, while the working class people pronounce French from the back part of the mouth. So, on parle comme ça, on parle comme ça. Yes, that's you can see in the French films many actors who know how to pronounce it from the back parts. And this is habitus. Habitus is acquired through learning and experience, but great parts of it become physiological. They become part of your physiognomy.
Okay, what about Michaela and Vienna job advertisements or translation agencies?
No, well...
I mean, that's a long way from parts of the mouth.
No, it's not a long way at all. Well, this is a beautiful exemplification of the whole. Bourdieu was very adamant about physiology, about the physiological internalization of the habitus, but on the other hand, he did not. Some people who criticized him, one wrote a very short time before his death the article, "How did Bourdieu learn to play tennis?" That was published in a sociological journal in England, and because some people interpreted his habitus concept as very rigid. But I agree with Anthony that this has become too much of not a phlogiston, but a garbage can, into which you, because there is no repertoire concept in these theories, you don't know what to do when you want to say that, for instance, in order to become a translator, you have to tell people, as many literary translators in Israel did. I quote Rakefet Selashef's work. They say, I have a piano at home, I smoke cigarettes after midnight, I do most of my translators sitting in bed, and so on. All these things that I drink wine, I go to cafes, etc. But young people have their habituses according to that, but theoretically it's... Anthony, I think you should have said, theoretically it is something disconnected from any other kind of conceptualization. It really emerged out of necessity, and as I said, half-baked, and people use it because it is still helpful and because they don't want to commit themselves to something different. As a matter of fact, for real research, it doesn't matter.
Oh dear me, Michaela, react to that.
No,
that's too far.
I know that you want to provoke, and I like
I-
it very much,
I
and I
miss-
like it
I-
being
I
provoked,
miss-
but still I think there is
Michaela, wait,
no.
I misinterpreted. I mispresented it, misspoke. I meant it is
No, you
helpful.
told me the digestivo, you know.
No, it is a helpful concept, even though it has such theoretical lacuna.
it has not a theoretical lacuna, I think, and I didn't want to go into that much details because I would have talked for more than 2 hours. But I think it is, of course, absolutely true what you say, how the habitus was, the first stage, I want to stress, was created by Bourdieu. But the habitus is not only the bodily, the physiological component of attitude, for example, of behavior. But I think what is much more important, and I think this is then what makes it operative, the agent's operations in the field, like for example the translation, is, and where you connect with the other categories of in the field, the ones which Itamais just mentioned. I think the habitus has much more to do in his theory, and this is, as I explained in my seminar this morning, the habitus, we need the habitus in the social theory of Bourdieu in order to understand why do individuals, I talk about individuals now because it's easier maybe to understand, why do individuals invest their capitals the way they do in a specific field where they try to take a position? Why do they act like this? Why they have different capitals at their disposal? So why do they choose under which circumstances and under which conditions do they choose their behavior or their attitude in the field? This is on the basis of the habitus. So habitus is more than this. Habitus is, of course, something which is internalized, which has become part of the body, which is the hexis, which I referred to in my paper. But at the same time, the habitus is something closely connected to it. This inculcation, social inculcation of how you explained it, from the childhood, from early education, from how you learn to eat, how you learn to dress, how you learn to masticate, to whatever, is something which becomes, when you grow into a certain field, when you take up we would have said norms. Bourdieu would never use the word norms, of course, which I think has already been made clear by what I had said before. But when you take up all these strands, these dispositions which you find in the field, then you you sort of acquire a sort of set of dispositions which you use in a specific moment, consciously or unconsciously, mostly unconsciously. As I said before, the habitus remains something which is unconscious. But we needed the habitus in order to enact our capitals, in order to act in the field. We cannot act without our habitus. And this is why, as you said, it is needed for the operation of the field theory, but at the same time it is something which we cannot look at in a disconnected way. And it is not, for this reason, I think it is not half-baked. But
no, it is half-baked because it emerged out of without roots. You see, norms, habituses, repertoires are competing concepts. I could say norms are the term norms, which has been suggested in various places, is no longer necessary once you adopt the notion of repertoire. Habitus is no longer necessary if you adopt the notions of patterns and models. And you like the word, so you use habitus instead. I don't object to that. I don't object to habituses at all. But I think that it has, Anthony tried to say that, and I believe that I do not manage to drive the point through. You learn something in life. This learning accumulates to something that accompanies you throughout life. But then at each single moment in your life, suppose you select your profession, you must then learn many new things. Yes, if you want to become a clerk in a bank, you have to begin to behave like a clerk in a bank. So you have to change your clothes, you have to change your language, you have even sometimes to change your gestures. So you have to learn something that is very bodily, and you even begin to change your view of the world. Money was not important to you at all before you became a bank clerk, but it all of a sudden becomes something terribly important to you. Some of my students wrote to me dissertations about the behavior of high-tech people. So if you are in high-tech, again, you learn a different language, you go to certain clubs. In certain countries you must learn how to play golf. Yes, in other countries you must learn how to play cricket. Because you are a high-tech person, you have to go abroad, you have to show people that you've been abroad and you know something about such cities as Venice, because you can't afford not knowing something about Grand Canale in Venice, and so on and so on. And this becomes again your new habitus. So you can learn it, you can teach it, you can even have courses in habitusizing people to pretend to be. I mean, what's the KGB was doing after all? When you went to a course, I know from
we're
sources.
off topic, Professor. Wait a minute.
KGB taught you to assume a certain personality. So you learned how to go to the United States or to Brazil or to Spain.
Yes, but this means that, of course it's right, but at the same time it's not at all right. Because when you learn, for example, in courses, how to behave, how to eat, how to whatever.
No, through life, not
okay,
through courses.
no, in course, you were talking about
Courses
courses. Let's take your clerk in the bank, which I think is a very good example. Of course you take up, of course you learn how to behave in certain situations. You learn how to dress, to eat, to talk, to whatever. But at the same time, this does not say at all that this is then your habitus. Because because habitus is only something which you take up and becomes bodily inscribed. And it does not mean that the whole knowledge which you get in teaching a habitus is something which you then really take up and you work with it through the rest of your life. My problem is when opposing the habitus as you do, you can oppose it. I have no problems if you call it this or that. I would never use pattern, for example, because pattern for me is like structure in German. Struktur is something so terribly inscribed and fixed and fixed entities. It's really very, very, very difficult, a difficult concept. Or System, because Systemanalyse is something completely different from
in German too. You can't say
in German it's something which you cannot use. But anyway, my question is, if you oppose to habitus as a term, my question is how you can integrate whatever you call it then, and whatever features it has, how can you integrate it into Bourdieu's theory? We cannot discuss habitus in a decontextualized way. We cannot say what happens when you teach it, then you have it, and it's something which is more than what, for example, Bourdieu says, or whatever are your object. My question is, whatever you object to it, in which way can the concept which you propose be integrated into his theory? I think this is the main question for me.
But we're not here to reconstruct Bourdieu.
No, but since the
if not, it's useless, because I cannot discuss the habitus concept without discussing the concept within the whole social theory of his field theory. It's useless. We cannot say it doesn't work. It doesn't work under which condition?
May I say one
Well,
more sentence?
I want to be more
I've
precise,
lost
you
it.
know,
Lost
more,
Hmm?
I don't know.
I want to try to get
Yes.
a guy to speak from the
Ah,
web.
Please.
This is an experiment.
So I'll speak another time.
You will certainly. I know.
But
No, please,
I'll
please.
say that I
Bashir,
don't,
you can speak now. We can hear you if you
Listen.
shout Bashir from
listen,
Iran.
I don't object to the word habitus, and I don't object to people using it. It's a very useful heuristic concept. There are lots of such concepts that help
Better than
us
systems. and
help
record-
us
record-
do things. But I think that it is
Do you hear me?
We will in a
redundant.
minute, Bashir. Yes, Bashir, speak to us from Iran.
Hi everyone.
All right.
I will ask you that how can we determine which translator has a conscious habitus?
That's a good short question.
Which kind of habitus led us to self-consciousness?
Ah,
Thanks very much.
there you go, Michaela. Lead us to self-consciousness.
Well, I think this
Thank you.
is the whole problem about habitus. Habitus is not something which is conscious, because once it becomes, once it acquires the feature of consciousness, it is no longer habitus. There are, of course, some conscious manifestations of habitus. But the habitus as such, you will never be able of ourselves to describe our own habitus, even if it's a very specific one like the translatorial one, where we know much more. We know much more how it should be, we know much more how we want to be, but it is much more difficult to say what are the components of my own, let's say, life experience or my own dispositions, which is still for me the most precise definition of it, which make up my habitus. This is really very, very difficult. I think it cannot directly connect it with consciousness. Then it is something else which is no longer habitus and which we need, of course, in the translation procedure.
So Shadis asks, if we can't uncover it, that means if it is hidden and unknowable in a way, how can it help us as translators?
It can help us as translators in the sense that in the moment when we know what it is made up, and in a moment it is when we understand that what are the driving forces behind our decisions when we, for example, translate, then it is something which makes the translation process more transparent, and it is something which helps us also understand which are the constraints the translation procedure is exposed to, always in a specific situation, because it is, as you mentioned before, it is something which very much varies from situation to situation. It is never something which we can generalize, and there is no universally stance of the habitus as such.
Andrew, do you have things? You don't. People in our Tarragona audience. Do you believe this stuff?
Anthony, just an observation.
Yes.
I want to ask something from Etomo. Etomo, you said that...
We'll do it here so people know what's going on.
Etomo, you raised the example of bank employee. I like that example because I work in a bank, okay? You said that people who work in a bank are expected to, I think, integrate that habitus, to adopt the formality of the bank, put on a nice suit and be polite and all these things, okay? My habitus was not made for a bank, that's why I quit the bank. So I resisted that habitus, which was, so I mean, so what's your position on that? How?
Well, you can grow up in a certain family
And the family teaches you.
No, let's give the world your wisdom.
Okay.
You can do this one. That one seems so odd.
You can grow up in a certain family, and that family teaches you certain habitus, and you resist it. So you have 3 brothers or 3 sisters in a family, and they can grow up eventually as different persons. Even Bourdieu himself, he grew up in the Béarn. His father was a very humble postman. There were no chances for him to become a personality in Paris, but because he was such a talented boy, he was selected by his teachers, and he was sent to Paris to learn at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and all of a sudden he wanted to become French. He told me he did not consider himself to be French. He was Gasconian. His language was more similar to Spanish than to French, and all of a sudden he's in Paris, but he hated the French until the very last day of his life, although he tried to learn how to become French. For instance, in order to learn how to become French, he bought a flat in Place de Vosges. If you know Paris, you understand that Place de Vosges is something that if you bought a flat there, you are the ultimate Frenchman. Because this is the place, this is the place where Victor Hugo had his. You see? So you can resist, you can unlearn things, and you can make a new personality. For instance, if you are born as Richard or Robert Zimmermann, one day you become Bob Dylan. When you become a Bob Dylan, you forget your habitus as Richard or Robert. What was it? Robert or Richard? Robert. All of a sudden, you're no longer Robert Zimmermann, and you assume an Irish name all of a sudden, and you invent Welsh, and you invent a personality that never existed, and people learn from that personality, and this is not something you just learn. You learn it consciously, you make it, you invent it, as a matter of fact, but then you internalize it, and it becomes part of you, and you forget the day when you invented it, and you no longer know. The writer Knut Hamsun was very fond of inventing names. He even invented his own name. Knut Hamsun, for instance, was born as Knut